Hey friend, grateful you're here. It is finally autumn proper, and we're here with a timely monthly wrap-up. Who would have thunk it? Not me. Do you know how excited I have been to just wear a pullover sweater and not be uncomfortable? There is tea, candle is lit. I have been dancing to Earth, Wind, and Fire on repeat. I am in my happy place right now. How are you? How have you been? Let me get cozy and comfortable. It is time for a monthly wrap up. So I know I've been talking on and on about the summer slump, but September was my new leaf, baby. Tons of books were read. I mean, not tons, relatively speaking, based on my own pace. A lot of books were read. There were a ton of good ones in the stack. There was a single DNF, and not because it was a bad book, but it was just not my type of book. But we'll talk about that in a second. I just wanted to say it is storming right now, and it's gonna storm all weekend. And in order to get this to be a timely monthly wrap up, I wanted to film it this weekend. So if you do hear pattering or rain sounds, it's because it's really nice and cozy and rainy outside. But yeah, I just wanted to put that out there. So let's chat some books. Something that I have been thinking about is book ratings. Every time I go to book club, we always start off with our book ratings, and it's so interesting to think about. I have moved away in my own personal reading from book ratings because I mean, one, I am a ruthless DNFer, and so if I'm not liking a book, I'm not reading it. So all of my books will at least be a 3-star read. I was thinking the other day what makes it a 3-star read for me, a 4-star read for me, or a 5-star read for me, and I'm not quite sure yet. I think for me it's hard to also assign a rating right after I've read a book. But yeah, I've just been thinking about that, and I don't think I want to become a book rater, but I was curious to see how my book rating compared to how the book was rated as a whole. And so I'm going to put up the rating of the book, and then I'm going to say whether or not I agree with that. And that's going to be sort of my just thinking in a room that I didn't typically think about with books, because I do think it's interesting to sort of class books. When I'm reading books, I think about what type of reader would like the story, but I don't ever think about what my rating is as a whole. I don't think it's a bad thing, because I do think, like, especially when you're reading different kinds of books, it's kind of hard to put them on the same line and then give them a numerical value. This is super tangential, and you probably don't care. Let's get started. My favorite book this month was Mrs. S by K. Patrick. I think this is the first book I've read all year where I was like fully reading a book for its language. Yeah, this was stunning, amazing. So this is a boarding school novel. Our character, our narrator, she is obsessed with the headmistress's wife, and we find ourselves like in the tensions of a one-sided crush where like the brush of an arm, the gaze, like all of this minutia becomes like really significant. The prose is like tense and hot, so good. There is this like start and stop that we find in the fragmented style of writing, which I think lends so much to this sort of will they, won't they, like longing and yearning. I think definitions around gender were really interesting. Conceptualizations and understanding of queerness was explored in this, and that was really interesting as well. What was going on in the book was really well captured by having younger women in the background. So like the puppy sort of crush that she had in the beginning, how like all of these innocent things became really weighted. That felt it just felt like the excitement of something that's new and novel when you're young. Working to define yourself, seeing the budding of that exploration in younger people, and still not being so clear on it yourself as an older human. I think it just added a lot of dimension to the fact that we're always working to like grow and develop and define, and that these experiences, no matter when they happen, there can still be something that's like childlike and new and novel about it. Something else that I really like about this book was that it sort of, because of the time period that this took place in, it wasn't really dependent on labels. And I think language has progressed in a way that it allows us to name things and find comfort and solace in being able to name a thing. But there is something about when you are exploring a certain idea, sort of removing the label and all of its weight and allowing the exploration to be purely about the thing. Super steamy. I thought this explored so many prisms and really multifaceted in what it was doing. So I will say that this is something that I would recommend to someone who is reading for language, maybe not so much story. Something that I read in the reviews were that this could have been a novella, and I kind of agree with that. I think it was a little bit long. For me, the thing that sort of kept me enraptured was the longing, the will they, won't they sort of tension in the book. That was really fun for me. And then as soon as they like got together, I was like, okay, like this could have been a little bit shorter. So I do agree that it might have been a little bit long. It's not very plot heavy. So yeah, so if you're a reader who likes heavily plotted books and don't care so much about the language of a book, this might be a little bit tough for you, because I think the writing style is pretty particular particular. And I do think it takes like a level of commitment to sort of fall into the flow of the prose. But if you are interested in language, explorations of queerness, if you're into like a steamy romp, I would pick this up. Oh, the rating. So this one, because I just finished it like a couple of days ago on Goodreads. So this has a I'm gonna just round out. So this is a 3.75 on Goodreads, and I would disagree with that. I would say maybe it is a 4-star read for me. The next book that I would maybe class as a tippy top favorite was The Details by Ia Genberg. This is a book that is translated from Swedish by Kira Josephson. So in The Details, we have this woman who's running a fever. While she's in this fevered state, she starts to recount past relationships with men and women. She describes all of these relationships in a very heightened and magnified sense. For me, I think this did a lot to like concretize the relationships that we have, like the frenzied ones, the hazy ones, the most difficult to put words to. I think this did a really good job of exploring those kinds of relationships. And then something that I thought was really compelling about this was that I think Genberg was looking at the passage of time and the fact that like a lot of the times when we're thinking about time, we don't think about it as like this linear thing that happens, but at least from the perspective of the novel, the passage of time is sort of knotted through the different relationships that we have in different chapters of our lives. And I think that I think about my life in that same way. I have like chapters of different relationships, and that's sort of how I clock the passage of time. So I thought that was a really interesting sort of look or take. It's not the events that sort of timeline our lives, but the relationships that we have, and we sort of understand ourselves through those relationships, through the fibers of those relationships, how those relationships become or had become epicenter at one point in our lives. And then she was also looking at how we immortalize those that have sort of like passed through our lives and we take on parts of them. And I thought that was really beautiful too. There's a quote: "That's all there is to the self, or the so-called self, traces of the people we rub up against. I suppose that is at the core of every relationship, and the reason that in some sense no relationship ever ends." This really felt like a camera zooming in and out, because we had these like broad landscapes and then it zoned in and we saw all of these details. I think in part that's sort of how like memory works, and so it was mimicking memory and how fragmented it can be. The fact that we sort of remember these like episodes with a person, not the entirety of the relationship, but these fragments. So yeah, it was like piecemeal and mosaic like, and reflected at least how I think about time and the relationships that have sort of left the deepest imprint on me. I just thought the explorations in it were really, really interesting. So that sounds like something that's up your alley or your cup of tea. I would highly recommend this. This again is not very plotty, so if you're looking for a book that has a lot of story sort of driving it, this might not be it for you. If you're interested in sort of these like themes of memory, time, immortalization, I would give this a read. I thought it was really, really beautiful. So this on Goodreads is a 4-star. I would agree with that. This is the 5th novel by this writer, but it's the first one that's been translated to English. So I'm curious if more get translated, because I think I would pick up other stuff by Genberg, but this was a beautiful, beautiful read. Then we read, where should I put it? I'm gonna put it here. We read I'm a Fan by Sheena Patel, and this was wild. When there is like a train wreck outside, I am one to shamelessly crane my neck to see what happened, and this book was that. This is for all the chismosas out there. So this woman's in a relationship, right? And she becomes obsessed with this dude who's in a relationship as well. Was he married? Yes, he was married. So this dude's married. She becomes obsessed with him. He has this like throng of other women that he is extramaritally entangled with, and there's one woman there who sort of like reemerges from his past, and he is obsessed with her. So we have the man our narrator wants to be with, and then the woman the man we want to be with is obsessed with. I feel like I need to draw a map. So the woman that the man she wants to sleep with is obsessed with, and who then she becomes obsessed with, she's like an influencer on Instagram. And so our narrator has this like bizarre way to access her. Homegirl is obsessed. She's refreshing the feeds, she's looking at posts, she's measuring who is in the post, who wasn't in the post before. It's a twisted, horrific parasocial relationship. So this book was written in episodes, and that was a cool structure to me. It was really interesting because the titles of the essays were all these memes at these moments of her like refreshing the feed and obsessing and sort of interacting with the man she wants to be with, and it's all very twisty and like horrifying but super compelling and captivating. And then she intersperses it with like social critique about like the woman who the man is obsessed with, her whiteness, and how her whiteness impacts her presence on social media. We see moments of the narrator's biography. She is also an artist. She's trying to make art, so she's sort of comparing the woman who she's obsessed with, her ease in sort of making things as opposed to like the difficulty that our narrator faces in art making. We see her critiquing all of these things, but then we're also seeing like how awful she is to her boyfriend. And yeah, it just seems like there's a lot of critique put on others, but then it never circles back in an introspective way, which I don't know if that was maybe the intent, because I do think that that's probably pretty common. But there was something a little bit incomplete or just like blind spot-y. For example, there's a part where she's talking about how the man who she's obsessed with, she's aware that he uses her, who is a woman of color, to signal something about him, a white man who's with a woman of color. So she has like all of these really interesting critiques, but then also like we sort of glimpse that like she's in a partnership with a white man and she's yearning for this. So she's not really like interrogating her own like preference for a white partner. So it just seems like super blind spotty, and maybe that's part of it. But yeah, sometimes it felt a little like wobbly to me. Not to say I didn't thoroughly enjoy it. I ate this book up. This one was rated as a 3.5 on Goodreads, and I would hard agree with that rating. This one again is not really grounded by any plot, but if you're wanting to read about something that's like very online and about obsessions and social critiques, this one's a good one to pick up, and it moves so quickly. It's like I need to figure out what's going on with this train wreck kind of read. So in line with our unhinged obsessive protagonists, we have My Husband by Ventura. This is translated from French by Emma Ramadan. If My Man was a book. It's about this woman who is sick for her husband. She's so obsessed with this man, which is fine, right? Like they're married. It takes place over the span of a single week. So we start with Monday. Let me just triple check. Yes, we start with Monday and we're moving through the week. It's looking at like the minutia and the mundanity of domestic life and how all of these small little things within a partnership can become like huge trespasses and huge events. So we see sometimes like the husband won't act the way he's supposed to. So he'll like make an infraction, and it's always something like really small. But then you'll see our wife punish him by withdrawing her attention, not responding right away. So there was like one day where the husband and the wife are with another friend couple and they're talking about like, oh, if you were a fruit, what fruit would you be? Her husband calls her a clementine. ¿Pa qué fue? So she got so offended. She got so upset and started to punish him for his choice in fruit. And then it's like she perseverates on the fact that he called her a clementine. There's another night where they're like sitting side by side watching TV and she puts her hand in his lap. She holds his hand and then he like pulls his hand away. ¿Pa qué fue? So she loses her shit. She starts to document all of his infractions and she starts to write her punishments, and she has all of these notebooks. There's one notebook where she collects all of the advice from like Cosmo and the like, and then she has her other notebook where she's writing down all his infractions and the punishments and the minutia of their relationship. And in the book with all of the like advice for being in a relationship, she sort of like fabricates how she shows up in her relationship. So she makes sure to like wait a specific amount of time before she responds to a certain thing. She like takes something out of his bag so that he has to call her and they have to have lunch together. So she's very calculated in a way that might be concerning, might raise a little red flag. And then stuff happens and it gets even weirder. But I thought this was sort of saying how like if we exist within the webbings of mundanity, can you really take this minutia and say it is mundane? Because that is the landscape of your life. And so all those little things are events, even though they may appear to be like little small things that no one should really be worried about or concerned about. So yeah, this was a weird little book. This was a fast-paced read. If you're looking for like a weird character study, pick this up because the twist at the end was fun. So yeah, an interesting one. Our Friend, My Husband was rated 3.75 on Goodreads, and I would probably agree with that. The next book we read was Happy Place by Emily Henry. Finally. So I started reading this book at the beginning of summer. I was listening to it on audio and it was all good. It was all great. I was kicking my feet. I was blushing on the bus. I was having a good old time. It's a book about this couple who is part of a larger friend group. They break up, but they haven't told their friend group yet. Friend group gets together because the house that sort of bonded them is getting sold, and also another couple in the friend group is getting married. In order to not ruin the weekend, they keep their breakup a secret. And then as the story progresses, we're trying to figure out why they broke up. And that's all fine and good. But then as we started to like focus on why they broke up, I was like, I can't do this. Like, I don't care. I don't care why y'all broke up. Like I do, but I don't. So yeah, so that's where it lost me the first go. And it's funny because like the tension, Emily Henry is so good at dialogue and banter. And so that was all really great. But then when it started to focus on like why they broke up, I could care less. Picked it up again, hardback and physical. circle. I got lost in the same exact spot, but we persevered. And it was a fun little read. I really enjoyed it. I saw how mixed the reviews were on this book, and nothing pulls me into a book like people not agreeing on the consensus of it. So for me, I would say I did enjoy it. I think there were interesting sort of conversations around friendships as you get older, friendships where dynamics have to shift because you have different responsibilities and different priorities as you get older, but how to also maintain maybe a new integrity in that friendship. I thought that was a really beautiful discussion and exploration. I thought there was really interesting conversations about like the roles that we have in society and work, doing the things that we want to do and not so much caring about like prestige and what labor says about us. So in the end, like sis stops being a doctor and just like makes pottery, and like I can relate to that. I relate to that desire to just like live a happy life and do things that make you happy. So while we had to like endure the bleeding heart stuff, I really love that the friendships were experiencing these growing pains too. Emily Henry is like known for infusing her romances with a lot of heart, and I think turning that sort of strength that she has as a writer onto friendships was just like a really heartwarming thing to experience. It was really sweet and it made me feel all the feels. Yeah, and like I said before, Emily Henry is like unmatched in how she elaborates her characters through like banter and dialogue, and that was a lot of fun to experience in this one as well. She is like my favorite brain off, funnies on type of writer. For the most part, I have like a ball reading her stuff, except for beach read. We don't talk about beach read. Couldn't do beach read. This one is definitely heavier on the plot, so if you're looking for a story with an actual storyline, you might be interested in this one. Goodreads rates it as a 4-star book. Like, I'm not gonna fight you on that 4-star. I might go a little bit lower, but 4 is fine for me. Okay, then we read Really Good Actually by Monica Heisy, and this one was a ton of fun. This one made me cackle. It made me laugh out loud. I thought it was really, really funny. Super enjoyable. I'm not sure if this was Monica's debut, but I will also be picking up whatever else she writes because this was really fucking fun. So this one is about a woman and a man who are in a marriage. They sort of fell into a marriage and like I guess this is the next thing we do. They end up in a divorce, and we're sort of going through the initial sort of like impacts of that loss. So we're talking singleness. Our girl is on Tinder. Our girl is reading self-help. She's embarking on all of these new hobbies to help her find her sense of self, you know what I mean? The caricature of healing and letting go, which obviously means absolute chaos ensues. There's one part where I think her friend does like rock climbing with her, and like 3 minutes in she leaves and she says, I can't do this is self-harm. And I thought that was really funny. There's also this really funny part where like she meets this dude. At first he's like, I don't think we should sleep together, and then he discloses that like he had cheated on his ex-girlfriend. The reply that Maggie gives is like, it's okay, you caught me at a good time. I've been reading a lot of Esther Perel. I lost my shit. I think there were a lot of funny one-liners. It just makes caricature of the little period right after a breakup where you're trying to piece yourself together and you're doing it with a lot of fervor, and I think to a lot of people it can seem like you're a little unhinged, but yeah, it was a ton of fun. Another little brain off, funsies on type of read. Really Good Actually was rated 3 stars on Goodreads, and I would also not fight you on that. I might rate it a little higher. I might rate it like a 3.5, but I wouldn't fight you on a 3. So then we read A Hidden History by Julia Shaw, and this was my nonfiction book of the year, I think. That's concerning, but it's definitely the nonfiction of the month, and this was really interesting. I thought it was interesting because I think a lot of the times in like LGBTQ book, bisexuality is just given like a little paragraph, and so to have a book that just like is dedicated to exploring being bi, I thought was really interesting and cool. So yeah, so there was a lot of great information on bi erasure, biphobia, the science of bisexuality. There was some interesting commentary on the differences in disclosure of bisexuality as opposed to like other identities under the LGBTQ umbrella. The fact that giraffes are bisexual, I thought that was really funny. But yeah, if you're looking on like an elaborated conversation on bisexuality, I think this is a great little nonfiction. I started it on ebook and then I finished it on audio, and I feel like both moved really quickly and were really accessible and easy to read. So yeah. Then we listened to Strong Female Character by Fern, Brady, and oh, so this was another nonfiction. Wow, look at us go. This was a memoir on an autistic woman who is sharing her experiences throughout her life, sort of not having the clarity of that diagnosis and how she was mislabeled and mistreated. So you see her struggling to understand herself and her behaviors, and the struggle in not being understood by those around her, those who are supposed to protect her and care for her. She was often put into these programs for like wayward teens and just a lot of misunderstanding about who she was as a person. She talks about how she found herself in these very sketchy sexual situations, sort of her meltdowns, the sort of sensory needs that she had. She talks about like stripping at one point, the sort of things that disqualified her from being understood as a person with autism, like having boyfriends and things like that. So I thought this was looking at how like dire things can get when you're not getting the proper supports, when you're constantly being misidentified, and sort of just like what happens when people refuse to take the time to understand you. I really found a lot of value in Fern sharing her story. It's interesting because everything is so central on like the child with autism. We don't often hear the narratives of adults with autism, and that's something that Fern talks about as well. I think it's important that these narratives be shared. So I found a lot of value. I highly recommend this one. It was like a very compelling listen. I listened to it on audio and I highly recommend it in that sort of format. Okay, then we read Ripe. I don't think I'm doing this by order of what I liked. I think I've liked everything I read this month, but baby, this book, oh my god. Dude, this book messed me up. Ripe is about a girl who is working in the tech industry. So she's working this like really high paying job in Silicon Valley, which is like the dream job, right? It's like she's made it. But then we're like zooming into the like rotting underbelly of all of these corporate jobs. And then moreover, late stage capitalism. And she's sort of making portraiture of this like stark contrast between like wealthy and unwealthy, people having shelter and being unhoused, just like suffering. Our narrator, she's sort of navigating these worlds. She's like moving through the tech industry, but also watching people like immolate themselves and express and communicate suffering. And Cassie is just trying to stay afloat. And Cassie has her little black hole, which changes in size depending on how she's feeling. When she's feeling despair, that little black hole gets bigger. And when she's not, it gets a little bit smaller, but it's always there with her. And that was really terrifying. This book felt like super dystopian, but also like hyper realistic, which is always a fun combo. There are these just like stratas of wealth and even how those interact together. So there are these scenes where they're protesting rent hikes. A girl that she knows just wants to go to brunch, and it was just like all of these different bubbles and how they sort of clash and avoid themselves and cross paths without having to cross paths. And that was a little bit sickening and realistic. So yeah, this felt like one of those hyper realistic paintings that sometimes we have to make eye contact with. And I think that's what was most striking for me, because I know that like, I think if you live in a bigger city, there is a level of dissociation that you have to sort of engage with to make it from like block to block, because there is just so much need. You as a single person cannot possibly right the wrongs of like a state, a system. If we were to like feel the full breadth of what it is to see someone in need and not be able to help that person and see it constantly, and that's the place of privilege, right? Then there's the actual person who is in actual need and who is watching people sort of flip. Yeah, it's a really hellish landscape that I think to a certain extent we might become numb to. And I think this was sort of shaking us awake and saying like, yeah, you're not alone in it, but also don't be numb to it. So I thought that was a really interesting book. There was one part, there were two parts. There are a lot of parts where like, I would love to discuss this with people who have read it, because I think the ending was really interesting. I think there's one part in the middle where we're talking about, and I won't get into any specifics, but like the inheritance of this black hole. That was really interesting. So yeah, this is a fascinating book. Sarah Rose Etter has written the Book of X, which I'm now very curious to pick up. I remember with I was listening to this, and the last chapter I listened, it ended and I was like, what? And I literally like replayed it right again, and yeah, it was wild. Felt tense. How many pages is this book? Felt tense the whole time. The entire time. Shoulders tense. Breath bated. This was a very clenchy read. No silver lining in this baby, but I think it was just like such a cool, not cool. Yeah, maybe it is cool, not cool. I can't say cool. It was just an experience, and I really enjoyed this. So Ripe, let me see how many stars it has. Ripe has 3.7 stars on Goodreads, and I think I would agree with that. I think if I was rating it, I would probably give it a 4. I think between a 3.7 and 5, like a high 3, 4 is where I would place this book. But yeah, really great. All right, and then the last book I read this month was Trick Mirror by Gia Tolentino. This was an essay collection that was also looking at the landscape of onlineness, the pervasive need to perform, how being online makes that like a looped verb, sort of something that like happens in perpetuity without this release valve. So she's sort of looking at performance and audiences and the self as a public thing in a public sphere, and then it sort of webs in and out of different levels of performance performance and definitions of self. She talks about how she was on a reality TV show and the audience that was involved in that. She talks about like women in novels and the assumed audience that comes with a novel. There's a really interesting essay on how women reach freedom and how oftentimes we have to abandon the self or relinquish the self. It was really fascinating because she was comparing her experiences in religion with like drug usage and how when you're on ecstasy there's sort of this absolution of self, talking about like mysticism, how it has been documented that women reach these levels of like ecstatic states of consciousness allow you to convene with the divine, and that oftentimes the way to get there is to like relinquish, annihilate the self, and that how sometimes that can feel like a reach towards death. So I thought it was like a really fascinating exploration, and the organization of the essays were also really cool. Like I thought it was a really fluid journey. There are a couple that I want to read physically that I have to look for, but I really enjoyed that essay. Trick Mirror, its rating. So on Goodreads, Trick Mirror has a 4-star rating, and I definitely agree with that. I think it's a perfect 4-star read. And then there was one book that I started reading that I stopped reading. I don't want to call it a DNF because I think a DNF for me can be like, I didn't enjoy this book so I stopped, and that's not what happened with Small Worlds. I think this has writing for a particular kind of reader, and I really want to encourage you guys to read this book because I think if you're a person who likes fiction written by a poet kind of vibe where like the writing is very lyrical, this is something that I think you would really enjoy. It's about teens who like have their first love experience and are parting and the growing pains of that, and also has some commentary on like the immigrant experience. I didn't get very far in it, and I think it's not the kind of writing for me, but I think a lot of people would enjoy this. Small Worlds, let me check. So this one has almost a 4.5-star rating. That's what I'm saying. Don't listen to me and my I just want to, you know, document this, but pick this one up because it's 4.5 stars on Goodreads. So yeah, those are the 10 books that we read in September. I am very happy with my reading month. I am very excited to continue reading. Currently, I am listening to Fourth Wing. Gonna start this one today, 1,000 Coils of Fear, and then on my Kindle I'm reading The Racial Incident, and I'm very excited. Yeah, I feel like we're back in it. I just wanna be reading, especially with this like wonderful autumnal backdrop that's currently happening in New York. So yeah, very excited. But yeah, I think that's it for this video. You know the drill. What are you reading? Is it good? Should I pick it up too? Hope you have been doing well, and we'll see each other soon. Bye.